Chapter 5. The gloom of night approaches. Indeed, Isaiah had been right. He was a bully. As soon as Ahaz began to rule on his own, people noticed the difference between the soft style of King Jotham's reign and the harshness now being seen everywhere. Nobody could explain the situation better than his own children. The oldest daughter was ironically named Athaliah, which means God is exalted. He wanted to sacrifice her to the god Moloch, but her mother prevailed to save her since she was a girl. His second daughter he did sacrifice. Athaliah, as young as she was, knew to stay far away from him. His first son was also sacrificed. At least 2 sons lived long enough to grow up, and one of them was heard to say, "My daddy is mean and wanted to sacrifice me, but my grandfather told me to pray to God, and he saved me." That child's name was Hezekiah. King Jotham had apparently had a good influence on his grandson, but none on his son. Ahaz had an idolatrous mother, perhaps from the northern kingdom of Israel. From an early age, she taught him to side with those who rejected God. They said the God of heaven had not answered their prayers, so they would follow other gods who paid more attention to them. They did not believe in God's promises because they complained that they never came true. When they prayed to Baal or to Moloch, they made money gambling. God never helped them with that. When they worshiped at the high places, they had fun and experienced captivating sensual experiences. That never happened at the temple. Besides, they sometimes saw priests from the temple taking part in the idol worship at the high places. Those with total resistance to God and his worship reinterpreted the history of Judah and Israel. They thought Ahab and Jezebel and their family had been martyrs. The hundreds of priests of Baal who had been slaughtered had been martyrs. Queen Athaliah was remembered as a martyr. Those who opposed them were the wicked ones. It was the God of Judah who caused their deaths. Those who rebelled against God thought there was nothing special about being descended from King David, because, as they reasoned, no Messiah would ever come. Whoever was the strongest seized the power. Right now, it was Ahaz. He intended to remain king for a very long time. He would do what the gods told him to do, so they would help him. Obviously, his first daughter's name came from this kind of twisted thinking. She was an exceptional child from the first. By the time she was 7, Athaliah had watched what happened to little girls when they were married, and she determined she would not get married. After some time to think about how she could avoid it, she hit upon the perfect plan. First, she had to be brave enough to talk to her father. Her mother would never approve of her idea, as it could expose her to danger. Watching for an opportunity when he was not in a terrible mood, she approached him. "Father, I know that you wanted to give me to the god Moloch." He nodded, wondering what in the world she was talking about. He almost never saw her or spoke a word to her. She was just a useless girl in his mind. "Since you did not get to give me to him, would it be okay for me to go and be his priestess?" He was touched that she had thought of this and would want to fulfill her father's wishes. Besides, he needed to do something special for Moloch in order to get on better terms with him, or at least on better terms with his priests. "Dear child, do you really want to do this? It means you would not get married and have your own family." What he was really thinking was how helpful it would be to avoid coming up with a dowry for her. She could be a useful political tool for him. "Yes, Father, I really want to do this." "Then you shall. We will not tell your mother until all the arrangements have been made." In this matter, he was as good as his word. By the time she was 10 years old, Athaliah was dressed in sparkling white robes and serving as a priestess to the god Moloch. In order to escape having an undesirable husband, she fixed her heart on serving this powerful God, believing what she had been told about him. It only took a few days for her to become an unbeliever. From watching the other priestesses and listening to the conversation of the priests, she realized that what went on here was hocus pocus. This was no powerful God. Powerful priests, yes. Some events were hard to explain, but nothing else. Nothing that she could believe in. So now what was she to do? From that moment on, she didn't believe in what she was doing, but she was royalty, and she did her work well, so she was promoted often. By the time she was in her early 20s, she was the high priestess, highly intelligent. She never told anyone what she really thought. She became so popular with those who came to worship that they gave her a special name. She was always referred to as the Virgin. Meanwhile, other events were afoot in Judah. Because of King Ahaz's total involvement in idolatry, God allowed the Arameans from the kingdom to the northeast to defeat him and take many prisoners to their capital, Damascus. As soon as that tragedy passed, God gave Ahaz into the hands of the king of Israel, who inflicted heavy casualties. In one day, King Pekah of Israel killed 120,000 soldiers in Judah. Zikri, an Ephraimite soldier, killed Ahaz's son Maaseiah, as well as the officer in charge of the palace and the man who was second to the king. When Isaiah realized what had happened right in the palace, not far from where he worked, he thought surely this would bring King Ahaz to his senses. But worse events lay ahead. Rampaging through the streets of Jerusalem and other nearby towns, the victorious Israelite soldiers herded together 200,000 women and children and began marching them out of the city. Girls who struggled were violated in the process. One little girl not old enough to marry was raped when she tried to hide inside the temple precincts. Wailing and moaning, she was dragged into the line. There she hunched over, clutching her torn clothing, weeping inconsolably. Two beautifully dressed women came over to her. One of them shook her shoulder gently and spoke. "You are now one of us. We recognize the symptoms. We all cried like that at first. You have to face the fact that your life will never be the same again. Once impure, always impure. That's what people think. Stay with us. We'll do all we can to take care of you." They wanted to stay with her, but soldiers grabbed them and shoved them into a different part of the line. The desolate little girl could hardly take in what they were talking about. Whatever it was, it did not sound good to her, and their kindness didn't make her feel any better. Many of the group were not dressed warmly enough for evening or night temperatures. That didn't bother their captors at all. They were plundering every house and shop and then piling their loot on the backs of the poor captives. In the midst of this melee, a motherly-looking woman with a small child in hand appeared. A few minutes before, she had been calmly going about her afternoon chores. Suddenly it came, faintly at first, then stronger. With a start, she recognized it from long before. "Come, my child," she said. "We have someone to encourage." "What's encourage?" asked the child. "You'll see," replied her kindly mother. As they walked through town, they saw that something bad was going on. People were running and crying. There were many soldiers and clouds of dust from flying horses' hooves. Yishka picked up her second daughter, Naomi, and held her close as they continued through the crowds. At last they came to a long, ragged line of people being closely guarded by soldiers. They could hear a lot of yelling and cursing. "Those men are talking bad," said Naomi. "Yes, they are," responded Yishka, "but don't be afraid. God will protect us." She was looking carefully at the people in line. She would know who it was when the time came. They walked a long way down the line of captives. Finally, Yishka knew who she was looking for. a young girl, not many years older than Naomi, was wailing hopelessly in the line. Yishka walked over, set Naomi down, and hugged the little girl. "You will finally have a home and family," she said. Shocked, the child stopped crying and looked up. She did not know the woman who had hugged her. "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm known as the prophetess. God sent me to encourage you." The girl was stunned into silence. Could she believe what she was hearing? Is it possible the great God had sent someone to help her? She knew about prophets, but she had never heard of a prophetess. A soldier was coming toward them. "Quickly, tell me your mother's name and where she lives. I will go and give her a message as well." The girl barely had time to give the name and address before the soldier brutally pulled Yishka and Naomi away from the line of captives. He had already looked her over and decided her child was too young, and there was something about her he did not want to tangle with. "Get away from here right now," he commanded. Yishka calmly picked up Naomi and walked away. "Mommy, did he hurt you?" "No, I am fine. God protected us. We need to pray for all these sad people." "Should we pray for the bad ones too?" "Yes, we should pray for them as well, that they will learn to worship God." She continued, "Now we're going to look for the little girl's mother. She will be worried about what happened to her child." Fortunately, the mother was at home, and Yishka was able to explain what had happened, leaving out the details and reassuring the mother that God would protect her daughter and bring her home again. Yishka pondered how God could possibly bring back the little girl, but God did not reveal that to her. Saddened by what she had seen, but secretly thrilled that God had chosen to use her again, she waited for Isaiah to come home and tell her more about the events of the day. It was with great relief that he found her and their daughters and little son when he reached home. Later in the evening, Anya appeared. She had spent much of the day in hiding. Now that the soldiers and the captives had left town, she also wanted to come and see if everyone was safe in Isaiah's home. When she saw all of them, she said, "Thank God!" Isaiah and Yishka looked at each other with shock. Had they heard correctly? Neither one of them said anything, but they hoped the praise was more than a passing thought in an emergency. The family ate supper in a somber mood, thinking of all the families that had lost their sons and fathers, also the families torn apart by the women and children taken captive. When Anya looked as if she were going to leave, Yishka invited her to stay, and she accepted with alacrity. The captives, stunned by what had happened to them, and staggering as they were forced to continue marching through the evening and into the night, stumbling down the steep and rocky road toward the Jordan River. Those old enough to think about it tried not to imagine what their future would be as slaves to the Israelites. Women with their children struggled to stay together. Smaller children were picked up and carried so they would not lag behind and get lost. Some women without children found those who were alone and tried to help and comfort them. The little girl, Tabitha, who had received the message, was determined to avoid the fancy women who had approached her. Instead, she was able to attach herself to a sympathetic woman who reminded her of her mother. Finally, when they had almost reached the river, the mass of people was allowed to stop for the night. With no food and no bedding, it was a miserable night. They were able to drink some water from a creek near their makeshift camp. Those without adequate clothes huddled together, trying to stay warm. They had covered almost 20 miles. Even though they were used to walking almost everywhere they went, most of the children had never walked so far. Early morning came at last, with no prospects of anything better than the day before. Their muscles were stiff and sore. They needed more sleep, and they certainly needed food, but there was none. They saw the soldiers eating, but not a bite was brought to them. The women looked for any fruit trees or wild herbs that might assuage their children's hunger, but little was found. Soon they were forced to begin marching again. Once they reached the Jordan River, at least the road beside it was smoother and mostly level. That made their journey a little bit easier. On the other hand, the weather was hotter. Those who had been cold the night before rejoiced until they got so hot that they yearned for the cool of the coming night. Tabitha hung on to the thought that God had said she had a future. What kind she did not know, but at least she was not going to die on this march. It was a long, hard day. They marched more than 20 miles. That night they camped by a river that flowed into the Jordan. Its water was cleaner, so they had enough to drink. Those who knew something about this area realized that the next day would be about another 20-mile march, bringing them to the city of Samaria. Then their dreaded fate would be decided. Marching while hungry was almost better than that. That night and the next morning were a repeat of the night and day before. How could they possibly go another day without food? But they had to keep marching. Women carried the little children. Now they began to see more people as they passed the smaller towns near Samaria. Those they saw looked wonderingly at them. The soldiers were proud of what they had done and were happy to tell the passers-by that they could come to the city of Samaria and get their pick of slaves. Mid-afternoon, as they approached the large city, 2 men came toward them on donkeys. It was soon obvious that they had already heard what had happened and intended to talk to the first soldiers they encountered. The older man introduced himself as the prophet Oded. Without polite preamble, he started in on the soldiers. Because the Lord, the God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. But you have slaughtered them in a rage that reaches to heaven. And now you intend to make these women and children of Judah and Jerusalem your slaves. Aren't you also guilty of sins against the Lord your God? Now listen to me. Send back your fellow countrymen you have taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. One of the soldiers responded harshly, Be still, old man. We don't have to listen to you. This is what war is all about. We haven't done anything wrong, and we deserve to have something for our trouble. Looking around, he noticed that some of the other soldiers were looking sheepish. He was just about to order them to fall into line when another larger group approached. The captives, who were near enough to hear, were paying close attention as they waited to see what would happen. This time, it was the major leaders from the tribe of Ephraim, 4 prominent men. Some of the soldiers recognized them and realized that they had to be respectful. These men had no time or patience for young, arrogant soldiers. You must not bring these prisoners here, the spokesman said, or we will be guilty before the Lord. Do you intend to add to our sin and guilt? For our guilt is already great, and his fierce anger rests on Israel. Several soldiers gathered to discuss what had just happened. First, the prophet had told them this was their sin, and God was angry with them. Now the leadership was claiming that all Israel would bear the blame. They were a nation mostly of idolaters. Assyria was closing in on them. They couldn't afford to add to their guilt. Those with the coolest heads among the soldiers hastened to agree with the prominent men. Then the highest-ranking soldiers agreed. Finally, even the common soldiers thought about the chance that they might have to fight the Assyrian army. With that, all the soldiers walked away with just their own belongings. The captives were left alone with the plunder and the 4 prominent men. A group of mothers hesitantly walked over to the men who were discussing what to do. Please, sirs, our children have had nothing to eat for 3 days. The men were appalled. You walked all this way and the soldiers did not feed you anything? No, sir. A crowd, curious to see who this massive group of people was, had gathered around by this time. The spokesman called out to them, Go into the city and get every loaf of bread and bring milk for the children. Bring whatever food you can find that is ready to eat. These poor people are starving." Many of the captives began to cry. They were so relieved after their horrendous trip that the thought of food and perhaps freedom was overwhelming. Next, the leaders appointed some of the crowd to help go through the plunder and find clothes and sandals for those who obviously needed them. A call went out for donkeys that the young and the weak could ride. Tabitha received sandals and a full set of clothes to replace those she had been trying to hold around her during the 3-day march. Food arrived in abundance. It seemed that everyone was eager to help. All of the captives ate and drank to the full. They were going back home. They were speechless with amazement. Before the group could head home, they needed to spend the night. Families took in mothers with their children. The size of the group overwhelmed the city's capacity, so others brought blankets and mats that could be used for camping outside. Guards were posted to protect them during the night. Everything possible was done to make them comfortable. They couldn't believe their change of fortune. In the morning, some of the mothers were asked to advise the leadership of Samaria on whether they felt the trip home should begin that day or whether they needed to rest longer. Every one of them wanted to start back immediately. The thought of their families waiting an extra day to know what had happened to them was unthinkable. All of the plunder was loaded on donkeys. Other donkeys carried children and any adult who felt too weak to walk. Yet more donkeys carried loads of food and drink and camping supplies for the trip. The group of 4 men decided to accompany them to be sure they were safe on the way. The trip south was totally different from the trip north. There was almost a holiday mood among them. If faster travelers passed them, they were asked to spread the word that the women and children were on their way home and should be met at Jericho with food and blankets and donkeys for overnight, and the trip back up the mountains to Jerusalem or other nearby towns where they had been captured. It was only necessary to spend 1 night with the guards on the way back. The last night and day would be with their friends and families camping near Jericho. After they set up camp, the guards spent the evening organizing the groups that would go to each town. That way, those who were not met in Jericho by family would have protection and companionship on their way home. The word spread quickly that the captives were returning. It was almost unbelievably good news. Yishka heard and prayed a prayer of thanksgiving for Tabitha and all the others. A huge crowd traveled down to Jericho to meet the captives and accompany them home. They were aware that many of them would discover that members of their family had been killed in the battle. They would need support of various kinds as they dealt with their loss, but first they would all need to spend the night before returning. Isaiah accompanied the group to Jericho and preached to the huge assembly, leading them in praising God for his goodness in saving their lives and overturning their captivity. They thanked God for the many Israelites who had sacrificed to make them comfortable and get them home safely. They expressed gratitude that almost all of the plunder would be returned to its owners. Then they prayed for the families of the dead soldiers who would now have to cope without their loved ones. Many of them would not know the fate of their family members until they returned to the towns where they lived. Finally, Isaiah pleaded with the group to turn wholeheartedly to God and worship him only. Then he would be able to provide all the safety and blessings he wanted to give them. In light of what had happened that week with so many killed and so many captured but then returned, the mood in the crowd was one of heartfelt desire to live in harmony with God. The guards who had accompanied them from Samaria slipped away as soon as they saw that their charges would be cared for. Lines of donkeys went back with them to their owners. For hours they traveled that night, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the groups from Judah. They were not sure whether or not some of the men would want to take vengeance on them for what the army had done. As they talked along the way, they discussed why it was that God had protected the women and children from captivity. Idolatry was so widespread in the northern kingdom of Israel that it was hardly necessary to talk about it. But the southern kingdom of Judah had claimed to remain faithful to God. The guards wondered whether their gods would protect them from the Assyrians. It would not be long before they would find out. Soon afterwards, Rezin, the king of Aram, Syria, and Pekah, the king of Israel, joined together to defeat King Ahaz, put in a king of their own choosing, and then forced Judah to join them in their fight against the Assyrians. The first time they came, Judah suffered a disastrous defeat, but Jerusalem was not taken. The enemies did not succeed because God was determined to keep a descendant of David on the throne of Judah. But they did capture Elath, a city at the north end of the Gulf of Aqaba, and chased out all the people of Judah who left there. When they left, Edomites, the descendants of Esau, moved in and have kept the town to this day. But they weren't finished trying to capture Jerusalem. They managed to get the Ephraimites to unite with them. When King Ahaz and his associates heard that all three groups were coming to do battle with them, their hearts were shaken as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Ahaz was terror-stricken at the prospect of being driven from the throne. An apostate, he had no intention of trusting God, even though it appeared to him that his kingdom was soon to fall. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out, you and your son, Shear-Jashub, a remnant shall return, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool, on the road to the launderer's field. Say to him, be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood. One more flicker and they will be gone." Their plan was directed against God and could not succeed. God sent Isaiah to the place where Hezekiah would later start his famous tunnel that brought water into the city. At the time of King Ahaz, this source of water was outside the city. Undoubtedly, some steps were already being contemplated as to how the water might be brought into the city and denied to an enemy outside the walls. Isaiah continued with the words God had given him. Rezin of Aram, Syria, and Ephraim and Pekah of Israel have planted your ruin, saying, "Let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make that Syrian Tabeel, whose name means good is God, king over it." But this is what the sovereign Lord says: it will not take place, it will not happen. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. Continuing, Isaiah gave King Ahaz the words from God. Ask the Lord for a sign. It is your choice whether it be in the depths of the sea or high up in the sky. But King Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. I don't believe in him and will not bother to ask for a sign. Ahaz refused to be persuaded. He did not want to believe, and he wanted nothing that might help him believe. The help he sought was that of Assyria, not of God. However, he was to have a sign in spite of himself. For the encouragement of those who would remain faithful in the years of crisis ahead, God saw fit to provide assurance that he would be with them. Nobody but Isaiah, an esteemed member of the royal family, could get by with talking to the king this way. He continued, Listen to me, you house of David. Is it not enough for you to try the patience of men? Will you also try the patience of my God? For that reason, the Lord himself will give you a sign. A mature young woman will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel, God with us. When he is 12 years old, he will eat well on curds and honey. Curded milk, yogurt, was considered a delicacy, and that together with honey implied an abundance of food. But when he is very young, before he is old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. Then the Lord will bring on you the Assyrians, a kingdom far worse than the two you fear. The Emmanuel sign would signify to God's presence with his people, to guide, to protect, and to bless. Many Old Testament prophecies have a twofold application, such as this: first to the more immediate future, and then to the more remote future and the eventual coming of the Messiah. And both applications of this prophecy came to pass. When Emmanuel was 2 or 3, Damascus fell to Assyria. When he was 12, Samaria fell to Assyria. The few who were not then carried captive could find plenty to eat in the desolated land. There was still more to the message God had sent to King Ahaz. Isaiah said that the Lord will send flies and bees, Egypt and Assyria. They will come and decimate the land, so that briars and thorns take the place of vineyards and fertile fields. The few people who will be left will carry bows and arrows, either as protection or to hunt. There will be plenty of good food for them to eat. King Ahaz evidenced his scorn for everything Isaiah had told him. "I don't believe any of that for a minute," he said. "Stop wasting my time and let me rule this country as I want to. You stick with your history writing and be sure you get it right." During King Ahaz's reign, Isaiah was frequently getting memos about not including certain events in the records. After all, Assyrian historians did not report the bad things that happened to their kings. Why should Isaiah leave a record of the few bad things that had happened to Ahaz? As a result, Isaiah followed a policy of keeping a second set of accurate records in his house. He could replace the official records after Ahaz was gone. Assyrian sources indicate that King Uzziah had taken a strong stand against Assyria, and probably also his son Jotham had. But King Ahaz was friendly to Assyria. He sent gold and silver from the temple and from his own palace to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, in order to purchase Assyrian aid. It was the growing power of Assyria, not the waning kingdoms of Syria or Israel, that Ahaz needed to worry about. During the next 40 to 50 years, Judah would be all but swallowed up by Assyria, and King Ahaz was pursuing a policy that would inevitably play into Assyrian hands. Athaliah had now put in years of pretending to follow something she did not believe in. She had status and influence and riches and no husband, but sometimes she thought it was not enough. There must be more than she had. And then Jared walked into her life. He was a slave, forced to work in the temple of the gods. It didn't take her long to discover that he was a God worshiper, not an idolater. His father had been killed in the war with King Pekah, and the family land had been confiscated by the Philistines, so his mother had no choice but to give him up so the rest of the family could survive. He was glad he could help his family, so he was never heard to complain about being a slave. The virgin acted very distant and avoided him whenever anyone else was around. But when opportunities presented themselves, she and Jared found that they loved to talk. It always had to be done with great care. But he was such a dependable worker that he was soon assigned to clean up after closing time and prepare everything for the next morning. Since she was the high priestess, she lived there. That provided the time they yearned for, time to be together. It wasn't long before they both knew they were in love. Athaliah was fascinated with a feeling she had never expected to experience. Jared was evangelistic as well as loving. He wanted her to know how much peace and freedom she could have if she lived in harmony with the great God. She laughed at him and said that all gods were fakes. She felt that if you believed, it was just in your mind. He responded that he hoped to live long enough to see her happy in the Lord. With frequent opportunities and no witnesses, their relationship eventually turned physical. She made it clear that she would never marry and intended to keep her job as long as she lived. Without any hope of an eventual life together, Jared finally ignored his beliefs, overcame his scruples, and started an affair with her. It was the most excitement both of them had ever had in their lives. Probably it was inevitable that the end came sooner than they could have guessed. The chief priests of Moloch and Baal had a running and bitter competition to see which one could have more influence in the palace and which one could make more money from their worshipers. Jared was the slave of the chief priest of Moloch. He frequently went with his master to the palace for some assignment or other. A few months after he and Athaliah met, he was once again in the palace with the high priest. Both high priests with their slaves were there, arguing over their latest conflict. Tempers were flaring. Voices were raised. Jared tried to tone down the fracas, which was becoming evident to every person within earshot and was embarrassing for both sides. The slave of the high priest of Baal, who was behind Jared, drew a knife and sliced him down the back. He died almost immediately. He was only a slave, so his body was quickly removed and dumped into the trash that continually burned. 3 days passed before Athaliah overheard what had happened to him. She was devastated, but could not show it under any circumstances. Life that had seemed normal before now became unbearable. Then within a month, she knew she was pregnant. It thrilled her that she was carrying Jared's child, but it gave her only a few months before people would find out, and then she would be killed, stoned probably. Not only was she not married, but worse, she was the virgin priestess. The punishment for breaking that vow was worse than the one for a pregnant and unmarried girl. Fortunately, her flowing white robes protected her for several months. That gave her time to decide what to do. One long night it came to her. She would declare that this baby was the child of a god. There were stories of such things happening. She hoped it would be a boy. A girl would be more difficult to pass off as sired by a god. At 8 months, she could wait no longer. She called together the high priest and the other priests and priestesses. With great ceremony, she informed them that the child she would soon have would be a demigod. She had been infused by one of the gods who especially wanted to bestow favor on their country by sending this child. She didn't announce it earlier because she could hardly herself believe the honor that was being bestowed on all of them. She had waited to be sure it was really happening. She was the virgin, but they almost didn't believe her. Yet because she was beautiful and popular and royal, plus there were stories about gods who had human children, there was a possibility that this was true. Nobody knew of any man she could have been with. She and Jared had hidden their relationship well. It would be dangerous to offend a god by asking too many questions if by chance he really had sent this child. It didn't take too long for the story to leak out of Moloch's temple. When King Ahaz found out, he totally disbelieved her story and wanted a trial as soon as she delivered the child. He was in favor of stoning her. He commanded that he be alerted immediately when the baby was born. Within a month, word reached him that Athaliah had given birth to a son. He rushed to Moloch's temple to confront her. There he found all the priests and priestesses surrounding her bed. When she saw him, she said, "Come, Father, meet your new grandson. His name is Emmanuel, God with us," or gods are with us. In an instant, Ahaz's anger was changed to shock. There was no way she could have heard about the sign God gave him. He still doubted this was a demigod, but something supernatural had undoubtedly happened. With a cursory glance at her and the baby, he returned to the palace.